In the beginning, there was only the river and the desert and the sky. The land that would become Egypt lay silent under the African sun, a narrow green ribbon threading through endless sand, and along its banks, the first people came to settle, drawn by water in a world of thirst. This was long before the pyramids, long before the pharaohs, long before the great temples rose toward the heavens with their painted columns and shadowed halls. This was the time before history had a name, before writing captured the passage of years, when the only records were the things people left behind. Fragments of pottery, stone tools worn smooth by vanished hands, the bones of the dead buried in shallow graves with their possessions arranged around them for journeys no living person could map. The Nile itself was ancient even then, carved over millions of years through the plateau, fed by rains that fell far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia and the Great Lakes of Central Africa. Each year the river rose, swollen with distant storms, and spread across the floodplain in a shallow sea of silt-laden water that left behind, when it receded, a layer of rich black soil. The Egyptians would come to call their land Kemet, the Black Land, distinguishing it from the red land of the desert that began where the floodwaters never reached. It was a sharp division, visible even today in satellite photographs, green and brown, life and death, separated by a line as clear as a border drawn on a map. But in those earliest times, perhaps 8,000 years ago, the desert was not quite so absolute. The Sahara was entering its final transformation from savanna to sand, and people still moved through regions that are now uninhabitable, following game animals and seasonal water sources, leaving behind rock art that shows giraffes and elephants, hunters with bows, dancers and herders, and creatures that no longer exist in those latitudes. Gradually, as the climate dried, as the grasslands retreated and the desert expanded, people concentrated along the permanent water, the Nile and its tributaries, the oases, the coastal lagoons, and along the Nile in particular, they began to stay. The archaeological periods have names that sound almost poetic now, assigned by scholars organizing artifacts into sequences: the Badarian, Naqada, Gerzean. These were not unified cultures but regional traditions, communities of farmers and herders who learned to cultivate emmer wheat and barley, to herd cattle and goats, to make pottery that they decorated with painted designs, geometric patterns, images of animals, boats with many oars, human figures with upraised arms. The graves from this period are simple but telling. Bodies were placed in oval pits, lying on their sides in a fetal position, facing west toward the setting sun. Around them were arranged the things they had valued or would need: pots containing food and drink, cosmetic palettes for grinding malachite into green eye paint, beads of carnelian and shell, combs carved from ivory, weapons for men, weaving tools for women. At Naqada, near modern Luxor, archaeologists uncovered thousands of these graves in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, dating from roughly 4000 to 3000 BC. The pottery sequence became so detailed that scholars could trace stylistic changes decade by decade, watching as simple red polished wares gave way to vessels painted with elaborate scenes, and then to a buff-colored pottery decorated with motifs that would later appear in the hieroglyphic script, the palace facade, the Horus falcon, the symbols of kingship that were already taking shape in the cultural imagination before any king existed to claim them. Trade networks extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, obsidian from Ethiopia, cedar wood from Lebanon. These exotic materials appear even in predynastic graves, evidence of connections spanning thousands of miles, of boats moving up and down the river and out into the Red Sea, of desert caravans following routes that would remain important for millennia. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were already distinct regions by this time, divided by geography and culture. Upper Egypt to the south, paradoxically, because the Nile flows north, was a narrow valley hemmed in by cliffs, its communities strung along the river like beads on a thread. Lower Egypt, the north, was the broad delta where the Nile split into multiple channels and spread across a marshy plain to meet the Mediterranean. The people of Upper Egypt were oriented toward Africa, toward Nubia and the south, toward the desert routes that led to the Red Sea and the gold mines of the eastern desert. The people of Lower Egypt looked toward the Mediterranean, toward the Levant and the trading cities of the coast, toward the sea lanes that connected them to Cyprus and Crete and Anatolia. Slowly over centuries, larger political entities began to form: chiefdoms, proto-kingdoms, confederations of towns united under powerful leaders whose tombs grew more elaborate with each generation. At Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, archaeologists discovered a settlement that by 3500 BC was already something more than a village. A town with specialized workshops, a brewery, a temple precinct, and a cemetery where some graves contained not just goods but sacrificed retainers, people killed to accompany their lord into death. The famous Narmer pallet, though it dates to slightly later, was found here, a ceremonial object carved from slate, showing a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other, smiting his enemies with a mace, standing in triumph over bound captives. His name written in hieroglyphs inside a serac, the rectangular frame that denoted royalty. Whether Narmer was the same person as Menes, the legendary first king who supposedly united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC, remains uncertain. The historical record is fragmentary, and the later Egyptian tradition, preserved in king lists carved on temple walls or recorded by Greek historians writing millennia after the events, is often contradictory. What seems clear from archaeology is that unification was a process, not a single event, a gradual consolidation of power, probably involving warfare and conquest, but also marriage alliances, trade agreements, religious legitimation, and the slow construction of an ideological framework that made unified rule seem not just possible but necessary, even divinely ordained. The symbolism of unification became central to Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh wore both crowns, or a double crown combining them. He was called the Lord of the Two Lands. Ritual scenes showed him smiting the 9 bows, the traditional enemies of Egypt, or performing the ceremony of uniting the two lands, tying together papyrus plants representing Lower Egypt and lotus flowers representing Upper Egypt. The capital of this unified kingdom was established at Memphis, at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, near the apex of the delta, a new city built on newly reclaimed land, symbolically positioned at the point of balance between the two regions. Its ancient name was Ineb-Hej, white walls, perhaps referring to fortifications or to the gleaming limestone buildings that would have stood out against the green fields and brown floodplain. Writing emerged during this crucial period, or perhaps slightly earlier, developing from the simple symbolic marks found on Predynastic pottery into a full system capable of recording not just names and quantities, but complete thoughts, narratives, theological concepts. The earliest hieroglyphs appear on labels attached to grave goods, on seal impressions, on ceremonial objects, short texts identifying owners, recording events, claiming divine protection. The script was always more than merely functional. Each sign was a small work of art, and the arrangement of signs within a text was itself a form of composition, with religious and aesthetic dimensions that went far beyond the simple conveyance of information. To write someone's name was to preserve their existence. To carve a text on a temple wall was to make it eternally true, to embed it in the fabric of reality itself. The first dynasty kings, Narmer, Aha, Djer, Djet, Den, and the others whose names appear on artifacts scattered across Egypt and Nubia, were builders and conquerors, consolidating their rule through military campaigns and monumental construction projects. Their tombs at Abydos, in Upper Egypt, were substantial structures of mud brick, with multiple chambers for grave goods and subsidiary burials of retainers. Dozens or even hundreds of people sacrificed at the king's death, a practice that would not last beyond the early dynasties, replaced by servant statues and magical substitutes, but which speaks to the absolute power these early rulers commanded, or at least claimed to command. At Saqqara, near Memphis, high officials built enormous mastaba tombs, rectangular structures of mud brick with deep burial shafts and elaborate superstructures, demonstrating the wealth and power of the administrative elite that managed the kingdom on behalf of the king. The second dynasty is more obscure, its history confused by later sources and by archaeological gaps. Some of its kings seem to have faced internal opposition or civil war. One pharaoh, Peribsen, replaced the Horus falcon above his serac with the set animal, perhaps indicating a religious schism or regional rebellion. His successor, Khafre, used both symbols, possibly marking a reconciliation or reunification. These are the kinds of questions that can never be fully answered. The silent gaps in the record where we can only speculate based on fragmentary evidence, a change in iconography, a distribution pattern of inscribed objects, the location and orientation of tombs. Yet through these uncertainties, certain continuities persist: the assertion of divine kingship, the administrative structure centered on Memphis, the religious importance of Abydos as a burial ground and later as the cult center of Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2686 BC, Egypt was no longer an experiment but an established civilization with its own distinct character, its patterns set for the next 3,000 years. A god-king ruling from the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt, an administrative bureaucracy managing agriculture and trade and construction projects, a religious system that saw divine forces in every aspect of the natural world, and an obsession with death and the afterlife that would produce some of the most extraordinary monuments human beings have ever built. The age of the pyramids was about to begin. The third dynasty opened with Djoser, a king whose name would be remembered for more than 4,000 years, and his architect Imhotep, whose reputation would eventually be so great that he was deified, worshipped as a god of wisdom and medicine, equated by the Greeks with their own Asclepios. What they created together at Saqqara was revolutionary, a structure that had never existed before, and that would define Egyptian civilization in the eyes of later ages. The Step Pyramid, the world's first monumental stone building, rising in 6 massive tiers above the desert plateau, visible for miles across the Nile Valley, a stairway to heaven built for a king who would ascend to join the gods among the stars. Before Djoser, royal tombs had been built of mud brick, substantial but ultimately temporary, vulnerable to erosion and decay. Djoser's pyramid was constructed of limestone blocks, each one cut from the bedrock of the plateau, and fitted together with extraordinary precision, creating a structure that was meant to last forever, and has indeed lasted, weathered but essentially intact for 46 centuries and counting. The pyramid itself was only the most visible element of a vast mortuary complex enclosed by a massive wall encompassing temples, shrines, courtyards, and subsidiary buildings, many of them carved to imitate the reed structures and mud brick architecture of earlier times, but rendered in eternal stone, doors that were carved closed, buildings that were solid representations of buildings, a petrified landscape of ritual architecture serving purposes we can only partially reconstruct from the fragmented evidence and from later, better preserved pyramid complexes. The Old Kingdom, spanning the 3rd through 6th dynasties from approximately 2686 to 2181 BC, was the Pyramid Age, when Egypt's kings commanded resources sufficient to build monuments on a scale that beggars comprehension even now. Djoser's Step Pyramid was followed by attempts at true pyramids, the Bent Pyramid of Sneferu, where the angle changes partway up, perhaps because the structure was beginning to show dangerous signs of stress, and the Red Pyramid, also built by Sneferu, which achieved the smooth-sided form that would become canonical. And then came the Pyramids of Giza. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BC, was the tallest structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years, a distinction it held until the construction of European cathedrals in the Middle Ages. It consists of approximately 2.5 million limestone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, fitted together with such precision that in many places you cannot slip a knife blade between the stones. The original height was 481 feet. The base covers 13 acres. The 4 sides are oriented almost exactly to the cardinal directions, with an error of only a few arc minutes. The internal chambers and passages demonstrate sophisticated engineering, corbelled ceilings to distribute the weight of the millions of tons of stone above, granite portcullises to seal the burial chamber, shafts that may have had astronomical significance or served as ventilation for the workers during construction. Standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, even now, after the casing stones have been stripped away from medieval construction projects, after the summit has eroded, and the passages have been explored and mapped and equipped with electric lights for tourists, the scale of the thing is almost impossible to process. The mind rejects it. Surely this cannot be the work of human beings working with copper tools and stone hammers, without iron, without pulleys or block and tackle, without even the wheel as a practical construction tool on the soft sand. And yet it is, demonstrably, exactly that. The product of organization, determination, engineering genius, and the labor of thousands upon thousands of workers over the course of decades. For a long time, The assumption was that the pyramids were built by slaves, by masses of conscripted laborers, driven by whips to haul blocks up ramps under the brutal sun. The discovery of workers' settlements at Giza has complicated that picture. These were not slave barracks but purpose-built communities with bakeries and breweries, sleeping quarters and administrative buildings, medical facilities where injured workers received treatment, even a cemetery where workers were buried with care and with provisions for the afterlife, not the treatment typically afforded to slaves. Many of the workers were probably conscripted during the inundation season when the fields were flooded and agricultural work was impossible, serving a kind of corvée labor obligation to the state. But there is also evidence of skilled craftsmen who worked year-round, of specialized teams who took pride in their work and left graffiti boasting about their productivity. The craftsman gang, the vigorous gang, names that speak of camaraderie and competition rather than of coercion and despair. The pyramid was not simply a tomb but a machine for resurrection, a physical embodiment of the Ben, the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos at the creation of the world, a symbol of emergence and ascension, of the king's journey from death to eternal life among the gods. The complex around the pyramid included a mortuary temple where the cult of the deceased king would be maintained, a causeway leading down to a valley temple at the edge of the cultivation where the king's body would have arrived by boat during the funeral, and subsidiary pyramids for queens and other members of the royal family. The whole assemblage was staffed by priests and administrators, supported by estates throughout Egypt that provided offerings, bread and beer, meat and incense, linen and oil, in perpetuity, or at least for as long as the endowments lasted, and the cult remained active. The pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure stand beside Khufu's, slightly smaller but still massive, still dominating the plateau. Khafre's pyramid appears taller because it stands on higher ground and retains some of its original smooth casing stones at the summit, giving a glimpse of how these structures looked when they were complete, gleaming white limestone sheathed with polished casing blocks. The pyramidion at the apex gilded or sheathed in electrum to catch the first and last rays of the sun. Near Khafre's Valley Temple, carved from a limestone outcrop left standing in the quarry, the Great Sphinx gazes east toward the rising sun, a lion's body with the king's head, or possibly the sun god's head, guardian of the necropolis, one of the most recognizable images in the world and also one of the most enigmatic, its symbolism layered and its original meaning perhaps lost even to the ancient Egyptians of later dynasties who cleared the sand from around its body and left stelae recording their own speculations about its origins. The theology of the Old Kingdom was dominated by the sun god Ra, whose cult center at Heliopolis in the Delta influenced royal ideology throughout the period. The king was the son of Ra, and at death he would ascend to join his father, crossing the sky in the solar bark by day and journeying through the underworld at night, perpetually renewed. The pyramid texts, inscribed for the first time on the walls of the burial chamber of the Pyramid of Unas, last king of the 5th dynasty, are the oldest religious texts from Egypt, a collection of spells and hymns and invocations designed to facilitate the king's transformation and ascension. O king, you are this great star, the companion of Orion, who traverses the sky with Orion, who navigates the Duat with Osiris. Utterances that mingle solar theology with stellar beliefs and with the emerging importance of Osiris, god of death and resurrection, whose cult would eventually become dominant in Egyptian religion. The administrative machinery required to support this monumental construction was itself monumental. The vizier, the king's chief minister, oversaw a bureaucracy that managed every aspect of the kingdom: tax collection, grain storage, labor conscription, building projects, foreign trade, legal disputes, irrigation maintenance. Below the vizier were treasurers and overseers, scribes and inspectors, a whole hierarchy of officials whose tombs line the cemeteries around the pyramids, filled with painted reliefs showing their daily activities and their aspirations for the afterlife. These reliefs provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of Old Kingdom life: farmers plowing and reaping, herders tending cattle, craftsmen at work in workshops making furniture and jewelry and statues, boats being built and loaded, fish being caught in the Nile, bread being baked, beer being brewed, offerings being presented at temple altars. But the Old Kingdom could not last forever. The later 5th and 6th dynasties saw a gradual weakening of royal power. a decentralization of authority as provincial governors, nomarchs became increasingly independent, ruling their nomes almost as petty kingdoms, building elaborate tombs for themselves and diverting resources that had once flowed to the crown. The pyramids of this later period are smaller, less well constructed, and in some cases have collapsed into shapeless heaps of rubble. The long reign of Pepi II, traditionally said to have lasted 94 years, probably represents a decline rather than a golden age, the king outliving his designated heirs, the administrative system ossifying, the economy straining under the burden of supporting an ever-growing number of mortuary cults for deceased kings and officials. Climate change may have played a role as well. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta show a period of reduced flooding around 2200 BC, suggesting lower rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands, less water in the river, smaller harvests, economic stress, famine. The transition from the Old Kingdom to the First Intermediate Period was not a sudden collapse but a gradual disintegration, a slow-motion unraveling of the centralized state, until by around 2181 BC, the unified kingdom had effectively ceased to exist, fracturing into competing principalities. The two lands divided once more, the age of pyramids giving way to an age of chaos and darkness that would be remembered in later Egyptian literature as a time when everything was turned upside down, when the natural order broke down, when Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, was replaced by Isfet, chaos and disorder. The literature of the First Intermediate Period and the beginning of the Middle Kingdom is dominated by pessimism, by laments for a lost golden age, by philosophical texts questioning the meaning of existence in a world where suffering seems to have no purpose. The admonitions of Ipua paints a picture of total societal breakdown. Lo, the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. Lo, the robber is a possessor of riches. Lo, noblemen are in distress, while the poor man is full of joy. Lo, he who had no grain is now a lord of granaries, and he who used to fetch grain for himself now has it issued to him. Whether this represents historical reality or rhetorical exaggeration, whether it describes the First Intermediate Period itself or is a later meditation on the fragility of civilization, is debated. What is clear is that this period was remembered as a traumatic interruption, a time when Egypt fell from its own high standards, when the monuments crumbled and the irrigation systems failed and provincial warlords fought over the scraps of the Old Kingdom. The political geography of the First Intermediate Period is complex and poorly documented. In the north, a dynasty ruling from Heracleopolis attempted to claim legitimacy as pharaohs of all Egypt but controlled only the Delta and Middle Egypt. In the south, a rival dynasty arose in Thebes, a city that had been relatively unimportant during the Old Kingdom but would dominate Egyptian history for much of the next 2 millennia. The Theban kings of the 11th dynasty gradually extended their power northward, defeating the Heracleopolitans and eventually reunifying Egypt under Mentuhotep II around 2055 BC. A reunification celebrated in reliefs and inscriptions, the king shown wearing both crowns once more, the two lands restored, Ma'at triumphant over chaos. Yet even in the darkness of the First Intermediate Period, cultural continuity persisted. The provincial nobility still built tombs and decorated them with scenes modeled on Old Kingdom precedents. Craftsmen still produced art that maintained Old Kingdom conventions even as it developed new forms and new subjects. The concept of the afterlife remained central, and the coffin texts, evolved from the pyramid texts but now accessible to non-royal individuals, were inscribed on wooden coffins, democratizing the spells and knowledge that had once been the exclusive preserve of kings. In some ways, the First Intermediate Period was a time of innovation, of regional diversity, of experimentation with new literary forms and new political structures that would be synthesized in the Middle Kingdom that followed. The Middle Kingdom, from approximately 2055 to 1650 BC, is often considered Egypt's classical age, a period of literary brilliance, artistic refinement, and political stability. It lacked the monumental scale of the Old Kingdom. Middle Kingdom pyramids were smaller, often built of mud brick with a stone casing, and most have collapsed, but it achieved sophistication in other ways. The kings of the 12th dynasty, which begins with Amenemhat I around 1985 BC, were administrators and builders of a different sort. They focused on infrastructure, canals, fortresses, irrigation projects. They expanded aggressively into Nubia, building a chain of massive brick fortresses along the Nile at the Second Cataract, some of them complex structures with multiple walls and towers, designed to control trade and extract resources from the gold-rich regions to the south. The Fayum Oasis, a fertile depression west of the Nile, connected to the river by a natural channel, received particular attention. The kings of the 12th dynasty, especially Amenemhat III, invested heavily in hydraulic engineering there, regulating the flow of water into the basin, expanding the area under cultivation, creating what was essentially an artificial lake, the Maoris of Greek writers, that served as a reservoir during low Nile years and turned the Fayum into one of the most productive agricultural regions in Egypt. The Pyramid of Amenemhat III at Hawara was associated with an enormous mortuary complex that the Greeks would later call the Labyrinth, a vast building with thousands of rooms, described by Herodotus as more impressive than the pyramids themselves, though nothing remains of it today except foundations and scattered fragments. Middle Kingdom literature includes some of the finest works in the Egyptian language: the Tale of Sinew, the story of an Egyptian official who flees to Syria after the death of Amenemhat I, and lives for years in exile before being pardoned and allowed to return home to be buried in Egypt, is a masterpiece of narrative prose, psychologically complex, thematically rich, exploring questions of identity, loyalty, and belonging. The Eloquent Peasant, a tale in which a wronged farmer delivers elaborate speeches appealing for justice, is a meditation on legal and ethical principles. The dialogue of a man with his soul debates the value of life in the face of death, with the soul arguing for enjoyment of earthly pleasures, and the man arguing that death offers release from suffering. Existential questions rendered in poetic language that remains moving even in translation. The Middle Kingdom also saw important developments in religion. The cult of Osiris, lord of the dead and ruler of the underworld, became increasingly central. Abydos, where the earliest kings had been buried and which was believed to be the burial place of Osiris himself, became the most important pilgrimage site in Egypt. Individuals who could afford it erected stelae or cenotaphs there, hoping to participate in the Osirian mysteries and to be associated with the god's resurrection. The annual festivals reenacting Osiris's death and rebirth attracted pilgrims from across Egypt, and participation, even merely symbolic participation through the erection of a memorial, was seen as essential for ensuring a favorable judgment in the afterlife. The kings of the 12th dynasty established a pattern of co-regency, with the reigning pharaoh appointing his chosen successor as junior co-ruler during his own lifetime, ensuring smooth transitions and avoiding succession crises. This worked well for several generations, producing a remarkable period of stability and prosperity. But the later 12th dynasty, and especially the 13th dynasty, saw a return to shorter reigns and political instability. The 13th dynasty, though it maintained control over most of Egypt, cycled through numerous kings, some reigning for only a few years or even months. The administration seems to have continued functioning, and monumental construction continued on a reduced scale. But the centralized power that had characterized the earlier Middle Kingdom was weakening. And then from the north, a new factor entered Egyptian history: foreign rulers who established themselves in the delta. Kings whose names were not Egyptian, whose gods were not Egyptian, who nonetheless claimed the title of pharaoh and ruled over a substantial portion of Egypt for more than a century. Later Egyptian tradition remembered them with bitterness as the Heka Kasut, rulers of foreign lands, a term that would be mangled by Greek writers into Hyksos, a word that carries connotations of invasion and oppression, though the reality was almost certainly more complex. The second intermediate period had begun, and Egypt was divided once again, but this time the division was not just political but cultural, and the reunification, when it came, would transform Egypt into something it had never been before: a military empire. The Hyksos remain enigmatic despite more than a century of archaeological investigation. They were not, as Egyptian propaganda portrayed them, barbarians who burned cities and desecrated temples, though there is evidence of destruction at some sites, and there was certainly warfare during their initial takeover and later during their expulsion. They seem to have been a mixed group, primarily of Semitic origin from the Levant, Syria, Palestine, who entered Egypt gradually during the late Middle Kingdom, and then, taking advantage of Egyptian political weakness, established their own dynasty ruling from the delta city of Avaris. They adopted Egyptian royal titulary, used hieroglyphic inscriptions, built in Egyptian styles, and worshipped the Egyptian god Set, whom they identified with their own storm god. But they also introduced new technologies that would revolutionize Egyptian warfare: the composite bow, made of laminated wood and horn, more powerful than the traditional simple bow; the chariot, a light, fast vehicle drawn by horses that provided a mobile archery platform; and improved bronze weapons and scale armor. Southern Egypt remained under the control of the 17th dynasty, ruling from Thebes, who maintained their independence and continued to style themselves as the legitimate pharaohs of Egypt, even though they controlled only Upper Egypt and portions of Middle Egypt. For decades, the situation was apparently stable, with the Hyksos and the Thebans coexisting in an uneasy equilibrium, engaging in trade and occasionally corresponding diplomatically. But at some point, probably around 1560 BC, the Theban king Seqenenre-Tao decided to challenge Hyksos' dominance. His mummy, discovered in a royal cache in the late 19th century, shows horrific wounds to the skull, blows from axes and maces that killed him, evidence of death in battle, or perhaps capture and execution. His son Kamosi continued the war, launching raids into Hyksos territory and intercepting diplomatic correspondence between the Hyksos king and the Nubian ruler to the south, revealing a coordinated attempt to encircle Thebes. It was Kamosi's brother, or possibly son, Ahmose, who finally succeeded in expelling the Hyksos around 1550 BC after a long siege of Avaris and pursuit into southern Palestine. The autobiographical inscription of a soldier named Ahmose, son of Abana, carved in his tomb at El Kab, provides a vivid narrative of the campaigns: the capture of Avaris, the siege of Shara in Palestine, the battles in Nubia where Ahmose re-established Egyptian control. This was not merely a restoration of the old order, but the beginning of something new. The 18th dynasty that Ahmose founded would not be content with Egypt's traditional borders. The humiliation of foreign rule had taught a lesson: defense required expansion, security required dominance, and Egypt must never again allow potential enemies to gain strength on its borders. The early 18th dynasty pharaohs were warriors. Amenhotep: I campaigned in Nubia. Thutmose: I pushed the southern frontier to the Fourth Cataract, far beyond the traditional border, and also campaigned in Syria, reaching the Euphrates River, and erecting a stela there to mark the extent of Egyptian power, a symbolic claim to dominion over the known world. From the southern cataracts to the great river of the north, Egypt was now an imperial power, extracting tribute from subject peoples, establishing garrisons in fortified cities, appointing local rulers who owed allegiance to Pharaoh, and bringing back exotic goods from conquered lands: cedar and lapis lazuli, horses and chariots, gold and incense, captives who would serve as slaves in temples and estates. But then, in one of the most remarkable episodes in ancient Egyptian history, a woman became pharaoh. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose III and the principal wife of Thutmose II. And when Thutmose II died after a short reign, his designated heir was Thutmose III, a child born to a secondary wife. Hatshepsut initially served as regent, exercising power on behalf of her stepson as queens had done before. But around the 7th year of Thutmose III's reign, Hatshepsut took the unprecedented step of declaring herself pharaoh, adopting the full royal titulary, appearing in reliefs and statues wearing the false beard and kilt of a male king, though inscriptions sometimes refer to her with feminine grammatical forms, creating a curious gender ambiguity in the texts. For more than 20 years, Hatshepsut ruled as co-regent with Thutmose III, though she clearly held the senior position. Her reign is marked not by military campaigns, though there was at least one expedition to Nubia, but by building projects and trade expeditions. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari in western Thebes is one of the architectural masterpieces of ancient Egypt, a series of colonnaded terraces built against the cliff face, harmonizing with the natural landscape in a way that later inspired countless imitators, but was never quite equaled. The reliefs in the temple depict her divine birth, her mother impregnated by the god Amun, who appeared in the form of Thutmose, and the famous expedition to Punt, a mysterious land somewhere on the African coast, perhaps Somalia or Eritrea, from which the Egyptians imported myrrh trees, incense, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals including baboons and panthers. The expedition to Punt is shown in extraordinary detail: the Egyptian ships sailing down the Red Sea, the meeting with the rulers of Punt, the loading of goods, the transport of living myrrh trees in pots to be replanted in the temple precincts. a celebration not of conquest but of trade and exploration, of Egypt's reach and sophistication, of the exotic wonders that could be brought home from the edges of the known world. Hatshepsut's reliefs emphasize divine favor, legitimate succession, and the restoration of Maat after the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period. She portrayed herself as a pious builder, restoring temples that had fallen into disrepair, endowing priesthoods, creating new monuments to the gods. When Hatshepsut died around 1458 BC, Thutmose III finally ruled alone, and he would prove to be one of Egypt's greatest military commanders. For the next 32 years, he campaigned almost annually in Syria-Palestine, fighting 17 major campaigns that are documented in detailed annals carved on the walls of the Temple of Karnak. The first campaign, in his 22nd regnal year, culminated in the Battle of Megiddo, where a coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes, who had rebelled against Egyptian authority, were besieged in the city and eventually forced to submit. The annals describe the collection of tribute, horses and chariots, gold and silver, weapons and armor, grain and wine, and the installation of Egyptian officials to oversee the region. Thutmose III's empire extended from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the Euphrates in Syria, the largest extent of Egyptian territorial control in history. The wealth flowing into Egypt from tribute and trade funded enormous building projects. The Temple of Amun at Karnak expanded dramatically, with Thutmose III adding a festival hall and obelisks, contributing to what would eventually become the largest religious complex in the ancient world. Provincial temples throughout Egypt and Nubia were renovated or newly built. The priesthood of Amun, already powerful, became immensely wealthy, controlling vast estates and commanding resources that rivaled the crown's. Sometime after Hatshepsut's death, whether immediately or decades later is debated, her monuments were systematically defaced, her name chiseled out of inscriptions, her images destroyed or usurped, her obelisks walled in. For a long time, this was interpreted as vindictive revenge by Thutmose III, but the evidence suggests it may have occurred late in his reign or even during his successor's reign, motivated not by personal hatred but by ideological concerns. A female pharaoh was an anomaly, a disruption of Maat, and by erasing her memory, later kings were attempting to restore the proper order of succession, to create a clean narrative in which Thutmose III ruled continuously from his father's death. It was an act of revisionism, of memory management, though ultimately unsuccessful. Hatshepsut's monuments were too numerous, her reign too well documented, and even with her names erased, the queen who became pharaoh could not be entirely forgotten. The successors of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Thutmose Thut, inherited a wealthy, stable empire. Amenhotep III's reign, in the late 15th and early 14th centuries BC, represents the apogee of Egyptian power and cultural confidence. He built on a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age, a mortuary temple in western Thebes that was the largest in Egypt, of which only the two colossal statues known as the Colossi of Memnon now remain, sitting in isolation in the middle of agricultural fields, their features weathered smooth, enigmatic and silent. He expanded the Luxor temple and made vast additions to Karnak. He built a palace at Malkata on the west bank of Thebes, an enormous complex with royal apartments, administrative buildings, kitchens, workshops, storerooms, a festival hall, and an artificial harbor large enough for the royal barge. The correspondence found at El Amarna, from the archive of Amenhotep III's son and successor Amenhotep IV, includes diplomatic letters from the great kings of the period, the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittite kingdom, addressing the Egyptian pharaoh as brother and equal, negotiating marriages and trade agreements, requesting gold. "Send me much gold, for in my brother's land gold is as common as dust," wrote one king. Egypt's wealth was legendary, and the diplomatic balance of power in the Near East hinged on Egyptian influence and Egyptian gold distributed to allies and vassals. But then, in one of the most dramatic episodes in Egyptian history, Amenhotep IV repudiated the traditional religion. Changing his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, he abandoned Thebes and built a new capital in Middle Egypt at a site now called El Amarna, ancient Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. He declared that the Aten, the sun disk, was the sole god, and he launched a campaign to close the temples of other gods, to erase their names from monuments, to suppress their cults. The reasons for this revolution remain debated. Was it genuine theological conviction, a mystical vision of monotheism anticipating later religions? Was it a political move, an attempt to break the power of the priesthood of Amun, which had become too wealthy and influential? Was it a personal obsession, the vision of one man imposed on an entire civilization? Akhenaten's reign, from approximately 1353 to 1336 BC, lasted 17 years, and during that time he created a new art style that abandoned the idealized formal conventions of traditional Egyptian art in favor of a distorted, exaggerated realism. Akhenaten appears in reliefs and statues with an elongated skull, a protruding belly, wide hips, and spindly limbs, features that have prompted endless speculation about medical conditions, but may simply be stylistic conventions or symbolic representations of the king as encompassing both male and female principles, both father and mother of his people, made in the image of the Aten, who was beyond gender. His wife Nefertiti, whose painted limestone bust is one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Egypt, appears alongside him in reliefs with equal prominence, participating in rituals that had traditionally been the king's alone, sometimes even shown smiting enemies, a posture reserved for pharaohs. The city of Akhenaten was built quickly, and it was abandoned almost as quickly after Akhenaten's death. The temples were open-air courts, not the dark, enclosed halls of traditional temples, because the Akhenaten was visible in the sky and needed no hidden sanctum. The royal family is shown in intimate domestic scenes, playing with their daughters, eating together, offering to the Akhenaten, a departure from the formal, distant imagery of earlier pharaohs. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence written on clay tablets in Akkadian cuneiform, show that despite the focus on domestic religious transformation, international relations continued. Vassal rulers in Canaan wrote desperate letters reporting attacks and requesting military assistance. The Hittite king negotiated over territorial disputes. The king of Elashia in Cyprus sent copper, but the sense from the letters is of an empire beginning to fray, of Egyptian attention focused inward while the international situation deteriorated. When Akhenaten died, he was succeeded briefly by Semenkhkha, a mysterious figure who may have been a younger brother or even Nefertiti ruling under a male name. Then came Tutankhaten, a boy of about 9, who within a few years changed his name to Tutankhamun, abandoned Akhenaten, returned the court to Thebes, and restored the traditional cults. The temples of the old gods were reopened, their priesthoods reinstated, and a stela known as the Restoration Stela describes the return to orthodoxy. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the marshes of the Delta had gone to ruin. Their shrines had fallen into desolation and become overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were as if they had never been, and their halls were a footpath. The land was in confusion, and the gods had turned their backs on this land. Tutankhamun died young, around age 18 or 19, and his tomb, though robbed in antiquity, was resealed and forgotten until its discovery by Howard Carter in 1922. The incredible wealth buried with this relatively minor king, over 5,000 objects, many of them of solid gold or gilded wood, including the famous golden mask, gives some indication of what must have been buried with more significant pharaohs like Thutmose III or Amenhotep III, whose tombs were thoroughly plundered in ancient times. Tutankhamun's tomb revealed not just treasure but the ideology of the royal afterlife. The nested coffins, the shrines, the magical objects and amulets, the books of the dead, the provisions for the journey through the underworld and the resurrection into eternal life. The Amarna period ended with Ea, an elderly official who had served under both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, reigning briefly, and then with Horemheb, a military commander who carried out a systematic restoration of order. Horemheb obliterated Akhenaten's monuments, dismantling Akhenaten and using the stone as fill in later construction projects, literally burying the heretic king's memory. The king lists carved in later temples omitted Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ai. The succession jumping directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the intervening reigns had never existed. It was a collective amnesia, an erasure of a traumatic episode, though as with Hatshepsut, the erasure was incomplete, and modern archaeology has recovered much of what ancient Egypt tried to forget. The 19th dynasty began with Ramesses I, an elderly vizier chosen by the childless Horemheb, who reigned for only a year or two before being succeeded by his son Seti I. The new dynasty came from the Delta, from the city of Tanis, and their patron deity was Ses, the ambiguous god of chaos and storms, who had been associated with the Hyksos, but who was also a powerful protective deity, defender of Ra's solar bark against the serpent Apophis, in the nightly journey through the underworld. Seti I was a warrior king, campaigning to restore Egyptian control in Syria-Palestine, which had weakened during the Amarna period, and its aftermath. His mortuary temple at Abydos, with its unusual L-shaped plan, and its 7 chapels dedicated to different deities, contains some of the finest relief carving in all Egyptian art, delicate, precise, perfectly preserved in the dry desert air, the hieroglyphs carved with such clarity that they seem almost printed rather than hand-cut. But the 19th dynasty is dominated by one figure above all, Ramesses II, who reigned for 67 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC, and who built more monuments, sired more children, and promoted himself more relentlessly than any other pharaoh. Ramesses II's reign is the last great flourishing of Egyptian imperial power, and he made sure that posterity would not forget it. His colossal statues stand at Memphis, at Luxor, at Karnak, at Abu Simbel. His name appears on monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia, often usurping the monuments of earlier kings by carving his name over theirs. His building projects are staggering in scale: the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank at Thebes, the completion and expansion of the hypostyle hall at Karnak with its 134 massive columns, the rock-cut temples at Abu Simbel with their 4 colossal seated figures of the king guarding the entrance, the new capital city of Pi-Ramesses in the delta, from which he ruled, and which served as the base for military campaigns into Asia. In his 5th year, Ramesses II fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite king Mu'talid II in Syria. The battle, described in epic inscriptions carved on temple walls throughout Egypt, is portrayed as a great victory in which Ramesses single-handedly turned the tide of battle after being ambushed and abandoned by his troops, calling on Ammon for help and then charging into the enemy like a god. His arrows never missing, his enemies falling before him in heaps. The reality was almost certainly more ambiguous, a tactical draw at best, possibly even an Egyptian defeat, since Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. But what matters is how it was remembered, how it was used. The Battle of Kadesh became the defining event of Ramesses II's reign, the proof of his personal valor and divine favor, repeated in text and image across Egypt, inscribed in the cultural memory as an Egyptian triumph. 16 years later, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III concluded a peace treaty, the text of which survives both in hieroglyphic inscriptions in Egypt and in cuneiform tablets from the Hittite capital. It is remarkably modern in its provisions: mutual defense, extradition of fugitives, respect for each other's territorial integrity, witnessed by gods of both nations. It was sealed by a marriage alliance, with Ramesses taking a Hittite princess as one of his wives, an event commemorated on stelae showing the Egyptian king welcoming his bride. The treaty held for the rest of both kings' reigns and beyond, bringing a period of peace and stability to the Near East, with diplomatic correspondence and trade replacing the warfare of earlier decades. Ramesses II lived into his 90s, outliving many of his children, and was succeeded by his 13th son Merembeta, who was already elderly at his accession. Merembeta's reign is notable mainly for repelling invasions from Libya and from groups called the Sea Peoples in Egyptian texts, a confederation of migrants or raiders from the Aegean and Anatolia, moving through the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities, displacing populations, contributing to what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse that ended the Hittite Empire, devastated the Levant, and marked a transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age across the ancient Near East. Egypt survived, but weakened, and the 20th dynasty that followed would be the last dynasty of the New Kingdom and the last period when Egypt could claim to be a major imperial power. The 20th dynasty is dominated by a series of kings named Ramesses, from Ramesses III through Ramesses XI, ruling from approximately 1186 to 1077 BC. Ramesses III, the second king of the dynasty, faced renewed attacks from the Sea Peoples and from Libyans, which he successfully repelled in a series of campaigns documented in reliefs at his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. The reliefs show sea battles with Egyptian ships ramming the vessels of the Sea Peoples, archers firing down from the decks, prisoners being led away in chains, They show Libyan warriors with their distinctive hairstyles and tattoos, their weapons and shields falling before Egyptian chariots. But despite these victories, the tone of Ramesses III's inscriptions is increasingly defensive, focused on protecting Egypt's borders rather than expanding them, on maintaining what had been rather than conquering new territories. Economic problems intensified during the later 20th dynasty. The village of Deir el-Medina, where the craftsmen who built and decorated the royal tombs lived, provides detailed evidence of the breakdown in the late Ramesses period. Ostraka, limestone flakes and pottery sherds used as scratch paper, record complaints about delayed rations, work stoppages, even strikes when the workers refused to go to the work sites until they received their overdue wages. The tomb of Ramesses III was robbed within a generation of his death, and the papyri recording the trials of the tomb robbers show a systematic plundering of the royal necropolis, with guards and officials complicit in the thefts, reselling antiquities and melting down gold, a symptom of social breakdown and loss of respect for the old certainties. By the end of the 20th dynasty, effective royal power had collapsed. The high priest of Amun at Thebes ruled southern Egypt almost independently. Ramesses X, the last king of the dynasty, exercised authority only in the north. When he died around 1077 BC, Egypt split into two polities: a dynasty ruling from Tanis in the delta, descended from the northern administrators of the late New Kingdom, and a line of high priests of Amun ruling from Thebes, exercising both religious and secular authority. This marks the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation that would last, with brief interruptions, for 4 centuries. The Third Intermediate Period, from approximately 1077 to 664 BC, is complex and poorly documented, with overlapping dynasties and disputed chronologies. The 21st dynasty at Tanis maintained diplomatic relations with Thebes, sometimes sealed by marriage alliances, both sides recognizing each other's legitimacy and avoiding open warfare. The tombs of the Tanite kings, discovered intact in the 1940s, contained treasures comparable to Tutankhamun's, demonstrating that despite political fragmentation, Egyptian craftsmanship and wealth had not entirely disappeared. Silver coffins, golden masks, jewelry of extraordinary quality, evidence that the Delta kings, though ruling over a diminished territory, still commanded significant resources. The 22nd through 24th dynasties are sometimes called the Libyan period because they were founded by descendants of Libyan settlers who had been incorporated into Egyptian society during the New Kingdom, serving as soldiers and gradually rising to positions of authority. The most significant king of this period, Shoshenq, is identified by some scholars with the biblical Shishak, who sacked Jerusalem during the reign of Solomon's son. Shoshenq attempted to reunify Egypt and even conducted a campaign into Palestine, commemorated in a relief at Karnak. But the unity he achieved did not last, and by the time of the 23rd dynasty, Egypt had fragmented further, with multiple kings ruling simultaneously in different regions, sometimes in open conflict. In the 8th century BC, a new power emerged from the south, the Kushite kingdom of Nubia, centered on Napata near the Fourth Cataract. The Kushites had absorbed Egyptian culture during centuries of Egyptian domination, adopting Egyptian gods, Egyptian royal titulary, Egyptian artistic conventions. When they conquered Egypt in the mid-8th century BC, establishing the 25th dynasty, they saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of true Egyptian tradition, more authentically Egyptian than the fractious rulers they displaced. Pi's Victory Stela describes his conquest of Egypt in terms of restoring Maat, of cleansing temples that had fallen into disrepair, of re-establishing proper rituals. The Kushite kings ruled from Thebes, lavishing attention on the temple of Amun at Karnak, and were buried under pyramids in their Nubian homeland, not the massive pyramids of the Old Kingdom, but steep-sided, relatively small structures that nonetheless represented continuity with pharaonic tradition. The Kushite period was brief, ended by Assyrian invasions in the 7th century BC. The Assyrian Empire, the superpower of the Iron Age Near East, had been expanding westward for generations, conquering Syria, Palestine, and eventually turning its attention to Egypt. Esarhaddon invaded in 671 BC, and his son Ashurbanipal completed the conquest in 664 BC, sacking Thebes and driving the Kushite king Taharqa back to Nubia. Assyrian rule in Egypt was short-lived and superficial, exercised mainly through vassals, but it ended any possibility of Kushite reunification and paved the way for the rise of a new native dynasty. The 26th dynasty, ruling from the city of Saz in the Delta, is often called the Saiti period. It represents Egypt's last native renaissance, a conscious revival of ancient traditions, particularly those of the Old Kingdom, 2,000 years in the past. Saiti art deliberately imitated Old Kingdom models, copying proportions, poses, and compositions from ancient monuments, but with a technical perfection and a self-conscious sophistication that distinguishes it from the originals. It is art about art, tradition about tradition, a civilization looking backward, seeking legitimacy and identity in its own antiquity. Psamtik I, the founder of the dynasty, reunified Egypt and restored central authority. His successors, Necho Sikkim and Psamtik I, conducted campaigns abroad. Necho famously attempted to dig a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea and sponsored a Phoenician circumnavigation of Africa. Site Egypt engaged actively with the wider Mediterranean world, hiring Greek mercenaries, encouraging Greek traders, establishing the trading colony of Naqada in the Delta, where Greeks could settle and conduct business under regulated conditions. But the site Renaissance was fragile, dependent on a delicate balance of power in the Near East. When the Persian Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, expanded westward under Cyrus the Great and his successor Cambyses II, Egypt could not resist. Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BC, and Egypt became a satrapy, a province of the Persian Empire. The Persians are counted as the 27th dynasty in the traditional chronology, though they were foreign rulers, and their rule was resented. Herodotus, writing a generation or two later, preserves stories, perhaps apocryphal, certainly tinged with Egyptian bias, of Cambyses desecrating temples, killing the sacred Apis bull, behaving with the arrogance and impiety expected of a barbarian conqueror. There were revolts and brief periods of independence during the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, ruling from various delta cities, attempting to restore native rule and defending against repeated Persian attempts at reconquest. The last native pharaoh, Nectanebo II of the 30th dynasty, was a prolific builder, adding to temples throughout Egypt, but he was defeated by a second Persian invasion in 343 BC. Egypt entered a decade of renewed Persian rule, remembered in later tradition as particularly harsh, until the arrival of a new conqueror who would transform Egypt yet again. Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, who entered Egypt in 332 BC, and was welcomed, if not as a liberator exactly, then at least as a preferable alternative to Persian rule. Alexander stayed in Egypt less than a year, founding the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, visiting the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where he was supposedly recognized as the son of the god, and making arrangements for the administration of his new conquest. Then he marched east to complete his conquest of the Persian Empire, never to return. When he died in Babylon in 323 BC, his body was brought to Egypt by Ptolemy, one of his generals, who had claimed Egypt as his share of the divided empire. Ptolemy established himself first as satrap, and then, in 305 BC, as king. Ptolemy Sota, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for the next 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic period is a strange hybrid, a Greek dynasty ruling over an Egyptian population, creating a culture that was simultaneously Greek and Egyptian, but not quite either. Alexandria became one of the great cities of the Hellenistic world, rivaling Antioch and Athens, its harbor crowded with ships from across the Mediterranean, its lighthouse, the Pharaohs, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, its library and museum attracting scholars and poets and scientists from throughout the Greek-speaking world. Here Euclid systematized geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth, the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible was created, and poets like Theocritus and Callimachus developed new literary forms. Alexandria was Greek in language and culture, cosmopolitan in population, but it was physically separate from Egypt itself, oriented toward the Mediterranean rather than the Nile Valley, and most Alexandrians probably never ventured into the Egyptian interior. The Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs to the native Egyptian population, building and restoring temples in traditional Egyptian style, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, portrayed in reliefs wearing the double crown and offering to Egyptian gods. The temples at Edfu, Dendera, Philae, and Kom-Ombo, among the best preserved temples in Egypt, were built or extensively renovated during the Ptolemaic period, their walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions recording rituals, myths, and the theological speculations of priestly scholars. But this was temple culture, elite culture, preserved and patronized by the Greek kings for political reasons but increasingly disconnected from the broader population. The priesthood maintained the ancient language and writing systems, but hieroglyphic literacy was restricted to a small class of professionals, and even they were operating in what had become an arcane scholarly tradition rather than a living language. The later Ptolemies were characterized by dynastic instability, palace coups, civil wars between rival claimants, and increasing Roman interference. Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and Egypt, wealthy in grain, was too valuable and too vulnerable to be left independent. The most famous of the Ptolemies, Cleopatra VII, was a skilled politician and diplomat who attempted to preserve Egyptian independence through alliances with powerful Romans, first Julius Caesar, with whom she had a son, Caesarin, and then Mark Antony, with whom she had 3 children. She spoke Egyptian, the first of the Ptolemies documented as doing so, and she presented herself to the Egyptian population as the living embodiment of Isis, the great goddess, mother of Horus, the divine queen who ruled not through force, but through wisdom and magic. But the rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian for control of the Roman world ended with Antony's defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Cleopatra and Antony fled to Alexandria, and when Octavian's forces arrived the following year, both committed suicide. With their deaths, Egypt's 3,000-year history as an independent kingdom ended. Octavian, soon to be renamed Augustus, annexed Egypt as a personal possession, not a regular province of the Roman Empire, so valuable that no senator was allowed to visit without imperial permission. Egypt became Rome's granary, shipping hundreds of thousands of tons of grain annually to feed the population of Rome, administered by Roman prefects, taxed systematically, its resources extracted for the benefit of the empire. Egyptian culture persisted under Roman rule. The temples continued to function, maintained by imperial patronage. Traditional religious festivals were celebrated. Egyptian priests continued to write in hieroglyphs, though increasingly they were the only ones who could read them. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 AD, a dedication to the god Mandules. By that time, Christianity had spread through Egypt. The old gods were being suppressed, temples were being closed or converted to churches, and the knowledge of how to read and write the ancient scripts was fading. Within a generation, hieroglyphic writing was incomprehensible, a decorative script whose meaning was lost, and it would remain lost for 1400 years until Jean-François Champollion deciphered it in 1822, using the Rosetta Stone. The history of ancient Egypt spans more than 3 millennia, from the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC to the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. And beyond that, if we include the Roman and Byzantine periods, when Egyptian culture gradually transformed into something unrecognizable. It is a history of continuity and change, of cycles of unity and fragmentation, of cultural confidence and existential crisis, of monuments built to last forever and monuments that crumbled into dust. The pyramids still stand, weathered but intact, visible from space. The temples remain, many of them still impressive, despite millennia of decay. The tombs, though robbed in antiquity, still contain paintings and inscriptions that tell us about beliefs and values and daily life. The papyri, preserved by Egypt's dry climate, record everything from great literature to shopping lists, from religious texts to personal letters. What did the Egyptians believe they were doing with all this effort? All this building, all this expenditure of resources and human labor? They were maintaining Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, the proper functioning of the universe. They were serving the gods, feeding them with offerings, housing them in temples, performing the rituals that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding and the world existing instead of collapsing back into the chaos from which it had emerged at creation. They were ensuring their own immortality, building tombs that would preserve their bodies and their names, making offerings that would feed their spirits, writing texts that would guide them through the dangers of the underworld and guarantee their resurrection in the field of reeds, where they would live forever in a perfected Egypt. A paradise that looked just like the Nile Valley, but where the harvests were always abundant, the weather always perfect, and death had been defeated. Whether they succeeded is a question each of us must answer for ourselves. The bodies have mostly perished. Despite mummification, the tombs were robbed. The offerings stopped being made thousands of years ago. The names were forgotten or erased. And yet, in another sense, they achieved exactly what they hoped for. We still know their names: Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Ramesses, Cleopatra. We can still see what they built, read what they wrote, understand something of what they believed and valued and feared. The monuments remain, degraded but recognizable, testaments to human ambition and human creativity, and the desire to make something that will outlast our brief lives. In the museum galleries, under glass, the objects they handled and wore and used have survived. The jewelry, the furniture, the tools, the toys, the cosmetics, the writing implements, the musical instruments. All the intimate debris of daily life preserved by accident of climate and circumstance, giving us a connection across the millennia to people who were profoundly different from us and yet fundamentally the same. The Egyptians knew that time was their enemy. They knew that everything decays, that stone erodes, that memory fades, that death comes for everyone. Their response was to build anyway, to write anyway, to insist that they had existed and that their existence mattered, and to trust that somehow, through some combination of careful preservation and divine favor and sheer stubborn endurance, some trace of who they were would survive, and it has. The voices of the ancient Egyptians still speak to us, if we know how to listen, in the hieroglyphic inscriptions that cover every surface of their monuments, in the prayers and poems and stories they wrote, in the images they carved and painted showing how they saw themselves and their world. We can never fully understand them, separated as we are by vast gulfs of time and culture and language, but we can approach them, carefully, respectfully, recognizing in their works the universal human drive to leave something behind, to matter, to be remembered. Standing in the desert at sunset, watching the long shadows stretch across the sand toward the pyramids of Giza, it is possible to feel a connection to the workers who built them, to the kings who commissioned them, to the priests who performed rituals in the mortuary temples, to the ordinary people who came on pilgrimage, to pray to the gods and to petition the dead for help with the concerns of the living. The wind that blows across the plateau now blew then. The stars that emerge as darkness falls are the same stars they watched, though they saw them as gods crossing the sky in boats, as the souls of pharaohs ascending to join the imperishable ones who circled the northern pole and never set. The moon rising over the eastern cliffs is the same moon, though they called it Thoth or Khonsu, and believed its waxing and waning represented divine battles between order and chaos, light and darkness, life and death. Ancient Egypt was many things: a civilization, a culture, a sequence of kingdoms and dynasties, a collection of beliefs and practices and artistic traditions. But at its core, it was an attempt to answer the fundamental questions that every human society must answer. Why are we here? What happens when we die? How should we live? What obligations do we owe to the gods, to our ancestors, to each other? The Egyptians' answers to these questions differed in many ways from ours, but the questions themselves are timeless, and their elaborate, beautiful, sometimes strange responses still have power to move us, to make us think, to inspire wonder at what human beings can create when they commit themselves fully to a vision. The history of ancient Egypt is not just the history of kings and battles and monuments, though it is those things. It is also the history of farmers planting and harvesting, of potters shaping clay on wheels, of weavers at looms, of mothers nursing children, of scribes learning to write, of priests chanting prayers at dawn, of builders calculating angles and measuring distances, of artists mixing pigments and sketching preliminary designs, of musicians playing harps and lutes and drums, of all the ordinary people whose names we do not know, but whose lives, in aggregate, made up the civilization we remember. They are present in the archaeological record as shadows, the fingerprints on mud bricks, the wear patterns on tools, the food offerings in graves, the graffiti scratched on walls, the letters home from soldiers stationed in foreign lands, the medical prescriptions, the legal contracts, the multiplication tables, the love poems, all the textual and material traces of individual lives lived thousands of years ago. We study ancient Egypt, not because it is exotic or alien, though it is both those things, but because it is recognizably human. The Egyptians faced the same challenges we face: how to organize a complex society, how to feed a growing population, how to manage resources sustainably, how to balance individual freedom with social order, how to make sense of mortality and find meaning in finite lives. Their solutions were their own, shaped by their environment and their history and their values, but we can learn from their successes and their failures, from their moments of greatness and their periods of collapse. And we can appreciate with something like awe what they achieved: a civilization that lasted longer than any other in human history, that produced art and architecture and literature of timeless beauty, that grappled seriously and deeply with the great existential questions, and that left behind a legacy that still resonates in our own time. The Nile still flows, carving its ancient path through the desert, though the annual flood has been tamed by the Aswan High Dam, and the landscape is transformed by modern agriculture and urban sprawl. The pyramids still stand on the Giza Plateau, surrounded now by the sprawling suburbs of Cairo, their stones worn smooth by wind and sand, their summits gleaming white limestone long since stripped away, but still massive, still impressive, still capable of provoking wonder. The temples remain, many of them tourist sites, their sacred precincts bustling with visitors instead of priests, their walls decorated with hieroglyphs that most viewers cannot read, but that specialists continue to study, still finding new insights into ancient theology and history. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere continue to yield discoveries: new chambers, new inscriptions, new understanding of ancient techniques and beliefs. Egypt is not finished revealing its secrets. Every year, new excavations uncover more evidence, more tombs, more settlements, more texts. Technologies like satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar allow archaeologists to map sites without excavating them, to see beneath the sand, to locate structures that have been buried for millennia. DNA analysis of mummies reveals relationships between individuals, migration patterns, diseases. Chemical analysis of residues in jars tells us what people ate and drank. The study of ancient Egypt is ongoing, dynamic, constantly revising its understanding as new evidence emerges and new analytical techniques become available. But beyond the scholarly investigation, beyond the tourism and the popular fascination, beyond even the preservation efforts and the museum exhibitions, ancient Egypt endures as an idea, a vision of a civilization that achieved greatness through collective effort, that valued order and tradition, that believed in transcendence and pursued immortality through art and architecture and text, that saw the divine in nature and nature in the divine, that created beauty for its own sake and for the sake of the gods and the dead, that left monuments so extraordinary that they continue to inspire and perplex us thousands of years after the civilization that created them passed away. The sun sets over the western desert, as it has set every day for billions of years, as it set when the first humans walked along the Nile, as it set when the pyramids were new and gleaming, as it set on the last day of Cleopatra's life when Egypt's independence ended and a new era began. The light fades from gold to orange to red to purple, the shadows lengthen and merge, and for a moment, in the brief interval between day and night, it is possible to imagine the ancient world, the same river, the same desert, the same sky, but a different landscape, a different city, different people with different clothes and languages and gods, living their lives, worrying about their children and their crops and their place in the cosmos, building and writing and praying, believing that what they were doing mattered, that their works would endure, that they would be remembered. And they were right.